Elizabeth mentioned this landscape that we have in the healthcare industry is changing. Everybody certainly is aware of that, and it's impacting into the employment landscape and what we often refer to as physician hospital employment part 2. And so a lot of my comments will be directed to hospital employment of physicians, although of course certainly there are physician practices that employ physicians and other clinics and other models that also employ physicians as well. But it'll have those overtones to it. And so when you have that and you look at today's landscape, it really is reminiscent of somewhat of the Wizard of Oz. And Toto, I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore, becomes very vivid because it is a different backdrop than what we've been used to. We've seen it once before in the 1990s where hospitals bought up a number of different physician practices and then they all wound up unwinding, or many of them did, which unfortunately simply led to a lot of work for lawyers and consultants and made nobody else happy in the process. But this time things are a little bit different. We're going to talk about some of the reasons for why. When you look at the national trends for physician employment, this is just one graph demonstrating it. And you look at the evolution of it over the past 13 years, and unfortunately, usually our employment data is about 2 years stale for both compensation and statistics. We can see that we've got the total physicians versus truly independent physicians, and the total physicians keep increasing while the truly independent physicians, which are the orange lines, are decreasing. And there's some factors at play that make that so that we'll talk about. 1 year alone, when you look at the jump from 2012 to 2013, it really becomes noticeable because you're moving in that 1 year gap from a 20% nationwide that are hospital employed to a 26%, so a 6% jump up. And you look at some of the other sortings out, if you will, going from practice ownership being the standard to really that waning. And we're going to look at a survey statistic from asking residents what their goal objective is professionally in terms of where to practice, and you'll see that very dramatically painted. You see the number in solo practice drop off about in equal numbers as to the amount of hospital employees jumping up. Physician practice employees increasing slightly, the number of hospital-owned practices decreasing, and some of that may be with the trend of acquisition, and then some of the unwind as compensations are sorting out, and we'll talk about that and try to prognosticate a little bit about where things may be headed, and then a slight decrease or drop off on the independent contractor type of arrangements. Here's the picture that really, I think, for me at least, demonstrates very vividly what the change has meant over a 5-year period for final year residents. If you look at coming out of school in 2003, hospital employment was a really very small number versus a dramatic uptick in 2008. And whereas partnership in a medical practice used to be the gold standard, and we used to draft a lot of those agreements and answer a lot of questions about, well, what you expect the partnership or ownership interest to look like and the valuation on that, and how do I guarantee that for myself contractually, that really has changed quite dramatically, as has the decrease in terms of a single specialty practice participation. What about South Dakota? And this was interesting as we started researching, and we do work across the country, and I was talking, did a presentation with the American Society of Medical Association Council about 8 years ago when we were in Idaho, and that group takes all the different components across the country, the legal counsel in-house for your state medical associations, and talks about different trends that we all are seeing across the country. And it was really interesting because I remember at the time Georgia was not seeing any movement towards physician employment, whereas different states such as Maine and others, really Wyoming was another one I recollect at the time, we're seeing tremendous jumps up in proliferations across the state. South Dakota right now doesn't have any published data. I understand that that's in the works, but certainly anecdotally there has been increase in movement towards hospital employment of physician practices. But here's your statistics as a whole. The population count for the state, the number of licensed physicians, and the number of physicians per 100,000 population, and the number of hospitals balancing out all of that. Where does this leave physicians in today's healthcare? I think some analogize it to the attack of the winged monkeys and a fear or concern that they're going to wind up like the Wicked Witch under the house, squished like a bug, because of all the changes that are taking place. Probably to have an illustration or cartoon on the other side of the spectrum, which really shows the tremendous opportunity for physicians that exist in healthcare, because you all are the only ones that can deliver the services that you can. You're the only one that has that clinical knowledge base and control of that thought process and that know-how. So many are viewing it as if they can get to the right source, whether it's innovation in terms of developing some sort of technology driver or app or what have you, or refining a procedure or the delivery of care, or looking at the care processes and say, I know as a clinician how to make this more efficient, and then looking to perhaps get some of the millions of dollars, billions of dollars available in government funding to study that and to introduce those efficiencies. That would be one other way of looking at this other side of the coin, if you will. But a lot feel attacked for a number of different reasons, and it has to do with all these forces kind of combining to make this perfect storm. So what are those forces that have been at work? You might have thought about many of them at different times, but when you sort of laundry list them out, it really becomes it has quite a lot of weight when you think about the one layer on top of another layer on top of another layer until you get to the physician satisfaction. And is one thing going to be the straw that broke the camel's back, which for many may be electronic health records right now. But there are all these different factors. So you look at, of course, we know what the backdrop looks like with respect to uncontrolled rising costs, and that's why we're experiencing so much change. There's this premise that when you look at factually and statistically what the healthcare costs are in this country, and where that fits in the GDP, and the fact that it's such a large chunk of it, and we've got to bring that down because the rise cannot continue, and everything else is doing is looking at ways to drive down those costs, and that's why we're getting the reform that we're getting in many respects. So it's leading to one of the easy, quote-unquote, easy targets for it. I'm not saying it's the right thing, I'm just saying it's an easy target, is to decrease reimbursement and to decrease compensation. So where do you go to? Go to some of the low-hanging fruits, which obviously make physicians very unhappy, the time investment and the overhead investment that they're making in terms of the delivery of the services that they do. And then there's some other subtler factors, but those factors are equally, if not more important. You look at what physicians had done in response to declining reimbursement and compensation, and some of those things started to kick in the late 90s, early 2000s, as everybody was lobbying and jockeying for their position of the piece of the pie and their specialty. And wisely and strategically, many physician practices looked at, can I go into real estate as a way to offset my declining reimbursement and compensation? Can I look at an ancillary service such as X-ray or lab or pharmacy or whatever would have relevance to my clinical practice in terms of bringing other way to the table? Look at a lack of capital, and then that certainly is also an important piece of the puzzle, because when you talk about physicians being a catalyst and bringing about change to the table and driving some of those initiatives, they have to have the monetary resources to be able to do that. They're not spending typically company dollars. They don't have an access to R&D. They don't have access to those money for expansion of physician practices. When we talk about employment, we'll talk about recruitment and how that's impacted and wound up in the hospital's lap that really makes it difficult for the physician practice to compete with. You're coupling that with increased overhead. You all know what the statistics are for physician practices. They're on average of 60% plus, and no business can continue with the overhead running at those levels and have that administrative overhead, which translates into a time demand, not only having to provide your clinical services to the patient, but for every hour spent doing that, oftentimes it feels like you're spending 2 or 3 in terms of keeping up with the paperwork or the EHR conversion or trying to put into place a compliance program because you're going to be audited, all of those different variables. And then, of course, demand, work harder. We're still in a production fee-for-service-based model. We're going to talk about some of the quality, quote-unquote, quality measures and changes that are coming along. But all of those things sell time. So there's some statistics about whether physicians are actually working harder or not working harder, but I think unequivocally everybody feels like certainly they're working harder, whether that's measured in patient delivery time or whether that's spent doing administrative burdens and demands. There's also the increased competition for the healthcare dollar. Who's going to get it? The specialists, the primary care, which of the specialists? The hospital is going to get it. Is the hospital themselves going to get it, or other ancillary facilities such as ASCs, et cetera? Where are those dollars going? Because the dollars are certainly finite. And then we're going to talk about this pressure, this trend towards hospital employment as physician practices get gobbled up, or as physicians enter employment agreements with hospital. You'll start to notice in communities those employed physicians receive preferential treatment, where they all of a sudden become all of the executive committee or the board of medical staff, and therefore it's very difficult for the non-employed physician to have an appropriate voice in the medical staff, what's in terms of referrals, and the hospital is encouraging their employed physicians to refer to other employed physicians as opposed to the independent physicians. All of those different things come into play in terms of this perfect storm, which then leaves it right for the physicians to say, okay, what am I going to do? What are options? What are my choices? And a lot of it, quite frankly, is leading to a panicked response, a defensive response, as opposed to a pragmatic, let's walk through the steps, let's look at this proactively in terms of long-range look and picture what makes sense for me and for my current practice. To think about, and these are generalizations, so I don't say this to offend anybody, but as a general matter, and we do a lot of counseling with physician practice groups in terms of strategic planning and what the positions for their next step should be, and oftentimes you observe this dynamic going on with the group. So you may have more senior physicians that are on the cusp of retirement that say, I've got 2 more years to ride this thing out, so I really don't care what the long-term range planning is, versus the younger physicians that maybe are looking at their rest of their professional career. So the dynamics become interesting in those conversations because they're different goals. So you might find the senior physicians becoming super conservative. Their retirement funds have been hit by the economy. They're seeing their compensations reduced. They're having to offer the new kids on the block more money just to get them come. And then be looking at what is the cash out from them because they're taking a beating from every different angle, so it seems. You have this phenomenon of, for the younger, newer doctors, and it's not physician specific. We see this in the law practice. Companies see this, whereas the whole mystery of the work-life balance. I want to come in, I want to work from 9 to 5, but I want to be paid equal to or paid more money than those who are used to being on call, on demand at any point in time. They may not be willing to compromise that lifestyle for taking risk. Both the senior physicians tend to feel the constant pounding from legislators and Medicare. There are some similarities and overlaps, and these are certainly, again, to a degree, generalizations, but important factors to put into the mix. So when you look at this concept of employment, what are the pros and the cons, and this is irrespective of whether it's hospital or in a physician practice, the employment versus the owning, if you will. So if you look at some of the common characteristics or refrains that we hear from physicians looking at an employment opportunity, they're saying, okay, well, no, I'm going to get rid of the overhead, because somebody else is going to have to deal with that, and we all, in likelihood, are going to get economies of scale and efficiencies, because it will become somebody else's problem and not mine. Of course, counterbalance to that is think carefully about that, because you actually may be getting dinged back or attributed back some of that overhead in the terms of expenses and compensation, depending on how that is calculated and how that's measured. I think also an assumption that my administrative hassles will go away completely with the wave of the wand, and I will be able to spend all my time focusing on my patients, which commonly is a goal for most physicians. I really just want to provide the patient care and leave me the hell alone for everything else, right? And I think that reality, though, something that you have to consider. You may decrease the administrative hassles, but you certainly aren't going to be able to eliminate them or even reduce them perhaps considerably enough to make a difference for you. Because one set of administrative hassles may be replaced by another set of administrative hassles if you're having to deal with meetings that you didn't have before, if you're having to deal with non-physician individuals and explain certain things to them. And a common characteristics we've seen is the problem when physician practices were acquired in the 90s was that once they acquired them, the hospitals really didn't know how to manage them and didn't know what to do with them. Better, and they certainly are listening more to physicians and getting physician input on those, but it certainly isn't a scenario in almost every case where the physicians can turn things over entirely to a non-physician administration. That goes hand in hand with the work-life balance. If I'm spending less time in the office because I'm doing less administrative work, then I have a better work-life balance. And if I'm an employed physician, then I'm almost working shift type of hours. And that really has become, again, the mentality. I'm going to be here from 8 to 5 or 9 to 5 or whatever the time may be. And when I leave, I leave. An important goal for many of physicians going into an employment relationship is also stabilizing compensation. And I do highlight that for you and say for a while, because you need to think very carefully about this in the context of the bigger healthcare landscape. So right now, from a regulatory perspective, whether it's a physician practice that employs the doc or the hospital that employs the doc, but probably more acutely so in the latter scenario, your compensation gets dictated by regulatory limitations because you, the physician, are in a position to refer patients both generally and for certain specific ancillary type of services that would implicate the anti-kickback statute and the START, which are two pieces of federal legislation that talk about what physicians can and can't do in their relationship with referral sources. In a nutshell, those statutes and regulations require any compensation that gets paid in an employment relationship to be something that's referred to as fair market value. So what that means is we look at surveys, look at other documentation sources to be able to prove what fair market values are for the services, and basically you can't overpay for the services being rendered because otherwise that's being viewed as paying for referrals. And so with that in mind, keep in mind what the larger landscape is doing. We're moving towards things like bundled payments, where the hospital and physicians are paying that sum for the services that they provide, and then it's left up to he who controls the pot, i.e. the employer, the hospital, to divvy out that money to the physician that they employ. Alternative payment models, other types of things where essentially that control of the distribution of funds is left to the hospital. If you take that and combine it with really what the theory of the day is in healthcare, which is if we put the patient and physician in the middle, really hospitals and other ancillary services providers, home health care, hospice, all of that, then become subject to the physician's control, but still have this tension where because of some of the reimbursement rules, the hospital gets paid 5 times more for physician services than the physician would get paid if he or she were in private practice. They're not going to carry along with that reimbursement mechanism for much longer. They can't afford to do it when they're being pressured to push down costs in healthcare. So when you cut that differential, what do you think is going to be the first thing that drops? The hospital's not going to have that upside that it's currently feeding off of. Therefore, the compensation payments to the physicians that they employ are going to drop so that they carry more of the profit. And when they start dropping among physicians in specialties across the country, the market value as you survey across the country and in specific regions is going to drop. So for your compensation is going to continue to drop. I'm sorry that's not cheerful, but I want everybody to be aware of what seems a good lock-in today. It will be a good lock-in for the future, because when you look at the terms of your employment agreement very carefully, you have a 5 or 10-year term, but look at how often your compensation can be evaluated and changed, and whether that is something that the hospital can do unilaterally. Okay, really important point. The other factors, less stress, the ability to take time off, having coverage, greater stability, all of those are certainly things that fall in the pros column and tend to make employment an attractive possibility. What are downsides? Well, as somebody once said to me, generally things in your professional life oftentimes boil down to 2 things, particularly in this physician world. It's money and control. And if people are happy about autonomy or control and money, then they tend to be happy in the professional setting. And what employment often does to independent thinkers, physicians who've been trained to work individually and to survive individually, is that loss of autonomy, because you all are responsible at the end of the day for that patient on your exam table or your operating room, right? So as you lose power, not only are you losing that power or control because somebody else may be telling you what to do, that's the nature of the employment relationship, more and more rules may be getting piled on to that relationship that don't create, that you don't have input into and you don't have control over, and they may be unilaterally imposed upon you. Oftentimes, and we saw this happen a lot in the 90s, was there was a reduced motivation to work. Now, the intentions may have been good. McConan is an employed physician, but then the practice wasn't being run very well by the hospital administration. Physicians got frustrated and said, well, to hell with it. I'm just going to take my paycheck and go home, because every time I turn, there's a robot being thrown up in terms of my practice. Maybe a bad fit. You just may have been picked the wrong partner and they're stuck in the employment relationship, and we're going to talk about ways to try to avoid that. You have a bad contract. It may not be unlike that managed care agreement that you signed, just looking at what the bottom line was. and you might not have realized all the pitfalls that exist in the contract. And then there's a limit or a a cap on what you can make. Whereas if you're running your own show, or you're running your own show with a bunch of your colleagues, there's less of the limits to the income. The only thing that's the cap is the overhead, the expenses, but otherwise you're out there working as hard as you can and you're realizing that income. I thought that this information was interesting because it gives you a real feel for, in this last wave of acquisitions, so it's a 2015 survey, of how people were feeling post-acquisition and usually employment resulting from the acquisition. So 70% said that their objectives were met. 94% said their administrative burdens were decreased. 7% said fewer hours. 32% said they were making more money, so not a whole lot. It's usually, going to preserve my income is the mentality. So the 40% said they're making about the same is not a surprise or shock. And 77% said they would make the same decision if they had to do it all over again. Now, you all had an MD after your name. You took statistics, some sort of mathematical computation along the way. That's why you're a physician and I'm a lawyer, because I couldn't do the math among other reasons. But you know that a survey is a survey is a survey. So it's the output's only as good as the input. So it was a relatively small sample size. It's looking at a particular point in time. We'll see what this type of survey is showing 2 years from now as the compensation arrangements are up for adjustments, and then also the reimbursement mechanisms are changing. But I thought it was interesting just to look at that. That backdrop and kind of the pluses and the minuses, I want to give you a preview of the next webinar that your association is going to be hosting, which is going to get into the real nitty-gritty of employment agreements. But I want to give you some teasers for that and make you lawyers for a day, and then also talk a little bit about negotiating contracts and some of the negotiating tips. So you all have resources that are available to you. That's the great news. The AMA has published a employment contract model. It was originally put out in 2008, and then subsequently there was a hospital-specific model employment agreement that has both a form and annotations that talks about and explains the various provisions and tries to assist educationally in the efforts of physicians to understand what they're signing. And recently, in this past year, AMA has released their physician practice employment agreement, which has been updated, and all of that is available to you all at the link that's at the bottom of the slides in front of you that I understand will be posted on y'all's website. So let's talk about what the important provisions are in the agreement, because these are just kind of some teasers for the things to come. Particularly now, when we're talking about employment, particularly in the hospital setting, the scope of services becomes hugely critical because it ties to your compensation and the burden that you're contractually agreeing to carry. And so I think most think I'm coming on to be an employee to go in and see patients and bill for the patients, right? That's really my job. We have to look very carefully at the scope of services to make sure it really says that. Does it say that you're going to be providing services in your particular specialty? Does it say you're going to be provided any and all services, not necessarily limited to clinical services, that the employer requests of you? Does it say that it can be anything we add on to your plate but compensation doesn't change? Does the agreement set boundaries for what those services are? Do you have the ability to have input and control of it? Administrative work, because it's layering on those administrative responsibilities, you may not be solving that problem you had in prior practice. And we'd be remiss not to mention the hand-in-hand component. You're going to do certain things for the employer, and what is the employer going to do for you besides cut you a paycheck every payroll period? The nature of your practice such that you have certain expectations of the employer in terms of administrative support, in terms of clinical personnel support, in terms of equipment, in terms of space, in terms of where you practice, in terms of who you practice with. All those things become real important. Let's say your hospital has come to you and pitched the concept that you're going to be the service provider, the quality service provider in your specialty. But what I didn't tell you is they're cutting deals with others in your specialty across town, and perhaps you don't particularly respect the others in your specialty, or they're throwing you in the tank with a bunch of other people that you don't respect. If they're in your specialty, you wind up jockeying for the patients within the system and the resources within the system. So if those expectations are there, it's really important to set those up front. So second to the compensation and the ability to get out of the arrangement clean and scot-free, probably this services provision is most important to physicians. So watch that particularly closely. You can counter for things that we talked about, the downs, the cons in an employment arrangement, by looking at things that give you autonomy throughout the employment agreement. So things like who's controlling the decision making, who's controlling the clinical decision making. And this becomes particularly important in the hospital setting. Are they leaving those things to the medical staff like they traditionally have been done? Are they putting those in the hands of a medical director or some sort of administrative person that have been hired by the hospital to fill that role? How does all of that work together? And we'll talk about that medical staff component because it's really, really important now more than ever. Who controls the decision-making in terms of assets? You know, who owns what, resources, who gets what, and help you get in terms of support. And then how strong and where does the physician's voice enter into decisions with respect to governance? If you're in a clinical practice that's owned by the hospital, if there's a tie break, all of those things go to the autonomy and control that the physician-employee has, because certainly that employment relationship by its very nature takes away a lot of that. Automation, another important area, again, to go back to services, compensation, and how you get out of the thing if it's not working. So how easy or hard is it to unwind, okay? Can you walk away without cause? This is that second bullet on your slide. That means you can, it doesn't matter what reason, you don't have to give a reason, you just give a certain day's heads up in writing and off you go. Of course, the counterbalance to that is you think you've entered into a 5-year contract with the hospital, but there's a 30-day without cause termination provision that allows the hospital to terminate without cause with 30 days notice. Well, you really all you have is a 30-day contract, which is really not what you spent all that time negotiating and trying to achieve. So you might look at, for example, eliminating the without cause termination provision for the first however many years you want to be locked in. And obviously, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So if you ask for it on one side, expect it to be dished up to you on the other side. So if you ask for without cause termination, the hospital's going to want one too, or the employer's going to want one too. The for-cause provisions oftentimes carry with it different monetary, in other words, they have a different effect once the relationship terminates. So you might get less bonus or no bonus, or you might get less benefits or no benefits or paid benefits depending on what they are. Or you might have a restrictive covenant that prevents you from practicing within a certain area or soliciting patients. So it becomes really important to look at that if there are differentials between the for cause and without cause. And you have to look very, very carefully at how that cause is defined. As a general rule, nobody likes to be terminated for cause because it can sound really good on your resume. So you want to make those things, in addition to the financial penalties that may come with it, you really want to make those things the big bad no-nos. You lose your license, you can't practice medicine, your DEA registration is suspended, and those should be objective other than subjective, so not at the employer's discretion. etc. Okay? All of those things impact the ongoing obligation and impact that we talked about as I've been talking. So practically also, what's the unwind? What's the communication to the patients? What is the communication to the staff? What does it mean in terms of extracting back out your medical records and getting your patients on board and getting patients lists? I think an interesting thing that AMA has advocated is if you're going to be terminated as an employee and you're now employed by the hospital, are there any due process rights that you have, like you have under the medical staff bylaws? And this is in another area where employment and the medical staff collide, right? If they're going to be terminated for cause for clinical reasons, you may very well want the medical staff to be making that decision as opposed to the employer. And I'll give you a really good example of this. We represented a wonderful young physician who was female, and she'd been working for a period of 2 years. There had been no performance problems. She was in an all-male group, and all of a sudden when she got pregnant with twins and had to go out on bed rest, they became dissatisfied by her clinical performance. The hospital's legal counsel came to me and said, well, if we don't get resolution of this employment matter, we are going to take medical staff action and she'll have reportability to the data bank. So why don't you recount for me the problems that you say that you've all of a sudden had, and let's go through those. Well, he proceeded to do that, and there were a list about 13 issues that they had with her. You went through all of those list of issues. How many of those do you think were actually in the hospital setting? In other words, at the hospital as opposed to in the office setting? There were only 2 out of the 13 were actually in the hospital setting, and those were really the most benign of all the quote-unquote concerns that they had. So you find even legal counsel forgetting the distinction between what's happening in the employment relationship and what's happening in the medical staff, which carries with it very different ramifications and weight because of the data bank reportabilities and all of those good things that go with it. So you want to think about whether, if it's clinical reason, the medical staff should be the arbiter of those things, because you get benefits from it. You get the opportunity to be heard and walk through a process that's fair. That's the due process part of it. You also have the ability to be reviewed by your peers, which is a matter of state law, carries with it certain confidentiality obligations and certain immunities from suit and being discovered in civil litigation and things that could be very important to you if you're the subject of all of that. You become important because is there an economic credentialing decision, meaning are you terminated or impacted for economic factors as opposed to quality of care factors, which the medical staff typically aims to avoid. They only look at the quality type of decisions. And then the other area of overlap that I've mentioned to you are you environment, because the hospital's gobbled up so many physician practices or employed so many physicians that you don't have an unbiased officer or an MEC, Medical Executive Committee, because they're all under the hospital's offices and feel compelled to follow the hospital's direction on a particular issue because they're beholden in a financial type of setting. So this medical staff relationship is taking on new twists in terms of the employment arrangement that's good to be mindful of. I believe on my kind of key provisions on the how easy is it to unwind or get out of the relationship, you have all of these restrictive covenants, which are a function of state law. So you really need somebody who has the know-how under state law to advise you is whether the employment agreement contains a non-compete that prohibits you from engaging in the services for a time period in a geographic area during the employment and post-termination, and is that non-compete enforceable? Many times we see physicians sign off on an employment agreement, sign a non-compete saying this is great, we don't see this being a problem, I love my group, I love the hospital, I love my employer, and then we get the phone call 3 years down the road, darn, I really wish I hadn't signed that because now I'm hamstrung and I have to leave the community based on what I've signed on all of that. Non-solicitation comes in 2 forms. It's either you can't solicit your patients, you can't solicit your employees are generally the two ways that you see those, and you may have those provisions in your agreement. If you're in an academic medical center, or if you publish a lot, or if you invent, the concept of trade secrets and ownership of your intellectual property becomes really important. What does the agreement say about who has the rights to what gets developed during the tenure? Usually the default is the employer has rights to all of that. And there may be ways at getting indirectly at a non-compete in the form of you may not have access to patient list, you may not be able to do other things that essentially would put you in a position of not being able to compete with your employer once you left. But most importantly out of this list, I want to highlight the last one, because we see this in many employment agreements, and if there was one thing you were going to negotiate, this would be it. If you were in a community where you really want to stay there, is concept of the clean sweep. You all may be familiar from the personal services arrangements, the service line agreements that were entered into commonly for radiology, pathology, and anesthesiology, where the hospital contracts with one of those hospital-based groups and says, in return for getting the contract to do all of our radiology work, we expect that if we terminate our relationship with you, you will resign your medical staff membership and clinical privileges. And that was the quid pro quo for getting the access to being the exclusive provider for a period of time. Now, we said never agree to anything like that, but we're seeing that now happen in the employment context, where if the employment relationship is terminated, whether it's with cause or without cause, the physician's agreeing to resign their medical staff membership and clinical privilege. So even if you don't have a non-compete, you're shown the door because you can't have clinical privileges and medical staff membership at the hospital once the relationship ends, which is wrong. So really be mindful of those and avoid those at all costs. Okay. Compensation, and we do want to mention and give you a preview of, again, a coming attraction. We moved generally. Many of these arrangements were done to kind of the lesson learned the first time was it was done on a flat salary, right? I'm going to pay you $250,000 per annum, and this is what you're going to do for me. Those became really ineffective because the hospitals were suffering from that problem of physicians becoming disenchanted and then stopping working. So when they have done it the second time around, there's a tendency to include some sort of production component, which is really to keep the physicians motivated and the hospital for keep them realizing revenue. So it is either the base salary with some additional bonus on it based off of production or a pure production model, and eat what you kill. You know, we assign the what you're producing less the expenses, and then maybe you get some portion of the net is your salary or what you get in terms of compensation. So we moved from that production now into a measure with relative value units or work RVUs. Relative value units has become a common measure to be seen with that. And really when you look at the future in terms of what we expect to be there or not there, is we're now working to quality, again in quotation, reimbursement measures. So if that's how the hospital is getting paid based on the physician's production or how the physician practice group is getting paid, it doesn't really matter how hard you're working or what your production is if you're not attaining these quality measures. So then we expect to see the compensation changing, and it already is changing off of these production-based models to include at least some component of a quote-unquote quality-based measure. Okay, so that becomes part of where we're headed in the future. No matter what type of formula you use for the compensation, we have that regulatory limitation of fair market value mentioned, and the enforcement authorities are looking more and more at the hospital-physician arrangements and holding both the hospital and the physician accountable for that. So you can't just turn your eye blindly and say, well, no, the hospital just made that offer and I took it up on it. You can be held civilly and criminally responsible. So it comes to focus in an important area. concept of what we do with ancillaries, when you become employed by the hospital captures all that revenue. So if there was an accounting in your previous practice where you got some portion of ancillary services, X-ray, lab, et cetera, that goes away when you get employed by the hospital. So if that was a revenue source, you'll have to find some other legitimate way to obtain that, because you can no longer get that from a regulatory perspective. How long are the amounts or formulas fixed? I've already mentioned that. In other words, you might think you've negotiated that 5-year contract, but your comp changes every year. That really doesn't do you any good. So right now, I think I would say the trend of what we're seeing is probably a maximum of a 3-year lock-in would be on the good side, although we're seeing some at 5 years, and of course we're seeing some less than the 3 years as well. And then this last component of the tie back to the services. Okay, because if you're going to be paid $250,000, but you're not just providing your clinical services, you're traveling to X to do free patient care, and you're attending meetings, and you're doing all of this stuff, you got to make sure all of that is encompassed in terms of what you're getting paid. So let's talk briefly about how you go about negotiating these things, because the first question we usually get are they negotiable? And I'll go right down to the last bullet on this slide. Everything's negotiable. It just depends on how badly they want you, okay? I do think it's fair to understand and expect that the employer has an interest, whether it's the practice or the hospital, in maintaining consistency in their agreements and in what they offer to certain people. But there's always going to be room, because they're going to want certain people or filling a need more than others. So that's the important thing to keep in mind. There's a misconception that negotiation, which oftentimes has cultural components to it, but there's this misperception, to go back to the image of the people arm wrestling, that it's about a win, and one person or one side's going to come out as the winner and one side's going to come out as the loser. But it's really more about doing your homework and gathering the facts before you sit down to have that negotiation, which can be done either by you, the physician, or it can be done by your lawyer. If it's the latter, the costs are going to mount up unless you set what the expectations are and the cutoffs are. If it's you, you may be in that difficult position of having to negotiate something and then having an ongoing relationship with your employer or the person you're negotiating with. So there are pros and cons to taking it from both sides. But regardless, either which way, number one, you should know what the employee, i.e. what your objectives are. And if you're represented by counsel and they're going to negotiate, you should be very clear as to what your objectives are. What are the most important things to you? Likewise, it's not enough just to know what you need to know what their side, the employer's objectives and their primary concerns are going to be, because both of those things can help inform what you can get, what you can't get, and what the compromise points are. Because you can't just come in aggregating or taking a scorched earth type of approach where you got to win, 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 okay? So you need to understand where the gives and where the significant gives, where you can afford to give and where you can't. It's important to understand what the other side's negotiation style is as well, because oftentimes matching that negotiation style can be helpful, or reverse or the opposite of that negotiation style can be helpful. Okay, oftentimes if somebody is going very adversarial and very go, gotta win, and then you take a softer approach of, I'm so sorry, but you need to understand, let me explain, let me help educate, let me get you information, it causes them to back down a little bit or be more receptive to ideas, and that's just one example of that. I think it's hugely important to listen. Not just get in there and advocate and make your side, but listen to what you're hearing from the other side. You may hear, I can't do this, but I can do that. Or maybe I can't do this because my board has a policy that won't allow us to do this, okay? So listen is a really important skill set in negotiation, more so than arguing or winning is. When you look at the relationship with the employer, it is not unlike a marriage. It is something where you want to avoid the wrong fit. You don't want to wind up in a situation of a divorce and having to pay lawyers to get you out and fighting about what the terms of the divorce, so to speak, are going to be. And there are ways to do that going in. I think it's not unlike the marriage. The things that bother you when you're interviewing or talking to a prospective employer a little bit, those are the things that are going to bother you a whole heck of a lot when you're in that relationship down the road. So it's the snoring that's cute becomes the thing that keeps you up and really, is going to end the relationship unless you get the CPAP or other help. So think about it that way. So it's helpful to have a real well-defined sense of self and what your goals are. Where do you want to live? What type of practice? I'm sorry, that's a typo, not what time of practice, but what type of practice do you want to have? What do you want to be known for? What money do you want? How much money do you want to make? Those goals that are important to you. Is it being associated with your peers that are employed by this particular employer? Is it having the resources or the reputation of the employer? Do your homework, okay? So it's not enough just to look at the sheet, the employment agreement or offer that's been given to you, but know who's left the employer and why. Have those conversations informally. Who else is going to be employed with you? That's the other groups concept that I mentioned to you. If you're going to be employed with somebody you don't respect, that could be a huge problem for you down the road. What's the leadership look like? So today I negotiate with Joe's CEO, love him, love his direction, respect his vision, but all of a sudden he's out tomorrow. And we've got backup plan in his leadership role. That could be a real problem. Hand in hand with what the financial picture looks like, ask for financials of the company. What's the practice or the hospital, and know what those look like, because if it goes down south and they're not able to pay your benefits, they're not able to pay your malpractice premiums, those things then make the employment agreement essentially defunct. Do you have the same philosophies? Are you clear about the expectations? And then one we see surprisingly time and time again, probably not from you all because you're on this call, but many times we see physicians that sign the agreement and they haven't even read what's in there, and they're afraid to ask the questions, or they don't know what questions to ask. So what we caveat you or advise you, be very, very careful of. This is the warning, danger. Well, Robinson, look really, really carefully before you leap. So do your homework, know your financials, know your politics, know the difference between aspirations and reality. And we can almost predict to a T, if it's not a collaborative environment going in, it's going to predict the demise of the relationship, okay? Consider long-term what's happening. We talked about the component of I'm getting in this to lock in my compensation when that's not really what's going to happen. And then protect yourself by reading your agreement, using the resources that are available to you. The AMA also has, in addition to their form agreement, their principles for physician employment that were really intended to talk about some of the unique features of hospital employment. And they include topics such as conflict of interest, advocating and making sure you're advocating for your patients, the correcting techniques and tools, the medical staff piece of it that we've talked about, and payment agreements and peer review. And that's the link to the AMA principles, which are nice to see. Wrap up and then take questions, but I want to do that before I want to talk briefly about legal representation. Okay. So the lawyers are the butt of all jokes, and I understand that and appreciate it. That's okay. We can live with it. We're pretty tough-skinned. But I'll also say nobody likes one until they need one, right? And it's not unlike a preventive medicine. So if you're doing your homework and getting the help on the front end, you're generally going to be a lot better off in the long run, because we've done this, we've seen this, we know where the pitfalls are. You all are very, very smart individuals. Being a lawyer is not rocket science. It's not as hard as what you do, but we know what to look for, just like you know what to look for on the clinical side. You know how you hate when the patients come in with their internet research and say, I've diagnosed myself with that? the same is problematic for lawyers. So it's great to ask and ask those questions, but let us help and do our jobs too. You get what you pay for, so don't ask about employment agreements at the opening play for whatever, the music recital for the child's kid. Go and schedule 30 minutes. Buy 30 minutes of time. It will be well invested down the road. And spend your money wisely. You get what you pay for, but really the most important thing is set those expectations up at front. Get somebody, don't get your sister's cousin who's a real estate lawyer to read your employment agreement. Go to somebody who does this for a living. And I'm not saying this to advocate for myself. I got plenty of stuff to do. But I'm saying that I see mistakes that happen when this happened. I'm not a real estate lawyer. I'm not a tax lawyer, and I would no more advise anybody to do what in that area. So the same holds true. But establish what you want to get out of it. If you want an estimate or a flat fee, ask for it. And understand the concept of the hourly rate, because you might ask them what their rate is and you might kind of flinch because it's high, but they may be able to get you to the result more quickly than somebody with a lower rate who has to spend twice as much time because they really don't know what they're doing. And in hand with that, employment agreements are not complex, so there should be associates and other people that have the skill set to do it within practice that have a lower hourly rate. We've already talked about the specialists, so I'm not going to repeat that. The employment resources for the AMA, look at them. They've spent time, the effort, the energy to put forth good products, so use it. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. So in with that and take any questions.
Just Elizabeth again from the Medical Association. Like they said, it's now time for questions, and we will kind of do this informally. So anyone with questions, just feel free to go ahead and ask here on the phone line. If you muted your phone, be sure to unmute, of course. A reminder, we also have Wes Cleveland from the AMA with us helping as well with questions. So the phones are now open.
All right, hour of chock full of information. So, take advantage of it. And I was so crystal clear that everybody understood perfectly what I'm saying. It's 9 o'clock Atlanta time, so I know that's not the case.
And don't want to ask the question out loud. I think I forgot to mention this earlier, but there is a little Q&A in the bottom here that I can watch for, and I can read that question out loud too if anyone wants to write the question in.
Yeah, I think, Elizabeth, as well, my contact information's on the very first slide too, so feel free to reach out if you're in retiring and it's late on our agenda too.
It's been crystal clear.
Thank you all. I appreciate the opportunity and have enjoyed talking to you. I hope it was helpful.
Thank you, Sydney. And in closing, I just want to say thank you to all of our participants here tonight, and thank you to the American Medical Association as well for its leadership in this series. With that, have a great night, everybody.